They called it the end of the world. Rome, the eternal city, the heart of an empire that once spanned continents, was supposed to crumble beneath the relentless tide of the Vandals. Yet, somehow, it survived. Not by luck, not by divine intervention, but by a battle almost no one remembers. A confrontation so secretive that history itself tried to erase it. How could an empire, weakened by decades of corruption, political chaos, and internal betrayal, suddenly defy the expectations of its enemies? How could Rome, whose coffers were empty and armies stretched thin, stand against a force that had already conquered cities, islands, and entire provinces? It was 455 CE. The Vandals, led by their cunning King Genseric, had swept across North Africa, plundering and pillaging with ruthless efficiency. Their fleet was fast, numerous, and seasoned from years of raiding. Sicily had fallen. Sardinia had been pillaged. And now the Italian coast lay exposed, almost inviting their invasion. The Western Roman Empire, already a shadow of its former glory, seemed incapable of resisting. The city of Rome itself was tense. Rumors of impending doom circulated through narrow streets and grand forums alike. Citizens whispered of the Vandals coming like a storm, inevitable and unstoppable. Panic began to spread. The Senate debated fleeing to safer territories. Many commanders favored retreat over resistance, convinced that defending the city was a death sentence. But in the shadows, a few voices refused to surrender. A handful of Roman generals and advisors believed the empire could still strike back, not with brute force, but with cunning. They devised a plan so audacious that, if it failed, Rome's destruction would be total, and if it succeeded, the world would never know of the true moment when the eternal city narrowly avoided annihilation. At the center of this plan was a young, relatively unknown Roman general. History barely remembers his name, yet his strategic brilliance would change the course of Rome's fate. He understood the Vandals not as mere warriors, but as overconfident opportunists, whose greed and arrogance could be manipulated. The key was not confronting them head-on. It was deception, timing, and exploiting the environment itself. Preparations began under cover of night. Along the Italian coastline, hidden barriers were submerged in shallow waters, designed to tear the hulls of enemy ships or trap them in narrow channels. Small villages were transformed into outposts, silently watching, signaling, and misleading the approaching enemy. Scouts moved like shadows, observing Vandal movements and feeding back critical information to the general. Every detail mattered. One misstep could doom the entire city. Meanwhile, misinformation spread among the Vandals themselves. Fires were set to create illusions of troop movements. False signals misled scouts into reporting phantom defenses. The Roman general knew that the Vandals' overconfidence was their Achilles' heel. They believed Rome was weak and scattered, unprepared to resist. That belief would be their undoing. As dawn approached, the tension in the city was palpable. Citizens dared not sleep, and soldiers prepared quietly for a confrontation that might never be acknowledged in chronicles. The stakes were enormous. This was not a traditional battle, with banners raised high and legions clashing in open fields. This was a battle of wits, precision, and secrecy, a confrontation where silence and patience were as deadly as swords. Rome's survival hinged on one decisive moment. The Vandals would have to be lured into a narrow channel, where their mobility would be restricted, and where the traps and ambushes could be most effective. Every soldier, every hidden weapon, every strategy had to work in perfect harmony. There was no room for error. As the first Vandal scouts were spotted on the horizon, the city held its collective breath. The moment of truth had arrived. Could this forgotten general and his shadow army save Rome from a force that seemed unstoppable? Could the eternal city, on the brink of collapse, survive against the tide of history? By nightfall, Rome's fate would be tested, and the result would be a secret battle that, though almost lost to history, would define the very survival of one of the greatest empires the world had ever known. Rome was a city on the edge of collapse. The streets, once bustling with traders, philosophers, and soldiers, now echoed with silence. Fear had settled over the eternal city like a heavy fog. Word had spread that the Vandals, led by their ruthless King Genseric, were approaching from across the sea. Sicily had fallen. Sardinia had been plundered. Now Italy's coast seemed open, inviting, as if daring the empire to resist. The Western Roman Empire appeared powerless. Emperors were nothing more than figureheads, their authority questioned by generals, senators, and ambitious politicians alike. The army, once the pride of Rome, was scattered, underfunded, and demoralized. Civil unrest simmered in the streets. The treasury was near empty. Every outward sign suggested that Rome's doom was inevitable. And yet, paradoxically, hope lay in this very weakness. The Vandals, like any conquerors, measured strength with assumptions. They saw disorder, corruption, and decay, and they believed the city would fall easily. What they did not see was the disciplined core of soldiers and strategists who had not yet surrendered to despair. Hidden within the crumbling empire were men who remembered what it meant to fight with precision, cunning, and patience. A plan began to take shape. It was audacious, even insane. The Romans could not meet the Vandals in open battle. Their fleet was too small, their legions too scattered. The enemy thrived on speed and surprise, able to strike swiftly along the coast and vanish before a counterattack could be organized. Any direct confrontation would have ended in annihilation. Instead, the strategy would rely on deception. The Vandals would be lured into a narrow channel, a trap carefully prepared along the Italian coast. Submerged obstacles were positioned to tear at the hulls of ships. Hidden archers and artillery lined cliffs and ridges. Even small villages along the coastline became silent outposts, watching, signaling, and misleading the enemy. Every element was designed to exploit a single weakness: the Vandals' overconfidence. Meanwhile, misinformation spread among the enemy. Fires were lit to create false troop positions. Phantom signals misled their scouts. The Roman general at the heart of this plan understood something crucial. The Vandals expected weakness, hesitation, and chaos. Instead, they would encounter precision, coordination, and traps designed to turn their own strength against them. Within Rome, tension gripped everyone. Citizens whispered anxiously, afraid of what the day might bring. Soldiers moved quietly, rehearsing signals and positions, bracing for a confrontation that might never be recorded in history books. Every moment counted. Every misstep could tip the scales toward total destruction. As dawn broke, scouts spotted the first Vandal ships on the horizon. The city held its breath. The enemy's movements were already being guided into the trap, yet no one knew if it would succeed. Could this small faction of Roman strategists, operating in secrecy, truly outwit a seasoned and ruthless fleet? The young general behind the plan had spent nights analyzing maps, tides, and wind patterns. He understood the psychology of the Vandals better than anyone. Their history of quick victories had made them arrogant. They assumed Rome was defenseless. That assumption was their greatest vulnerability. Hours passed like an eternity. Every flicker of light along the coast, every subtle signal from the villages, every movement of Roman soldiers was critical. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether these preparations would be enough to save it from destruction. Rome's survival hung by a thread. On one side, a fleet of experienced and ruthless Vandals. On the other, a shadow army, relying not on strength, but on cunning and secrecy. The stakes could not have been higher. And yet, one question remained. As the Vandal ships drew ever closer to the narrow channel, perfectly guided into the Roman trap, the city had to wonder, would this hidden plan work? Or would Rome finally face a catastrophe that would erase it from history forever? Dawn had barely broken over the Italian coast when the first Vandal ships appeared on the horizon. Their long hulls cut through the calm waters with effortless speed, each vessel bristling with warriors eager for conquest. The banners of Genseric's fleet rippled in the morning breeze, symbols of power and impending destruction. They believed victory was theirs before a single sword had been drawn. But the Vandals had underestimated what awaited them. The channel ahead, seemingly open and unguarded, was a trap meticulously prepared by men who had nothing left to lose, but everything to protect. Hidden stakes lurked beneath the water's surface. Narrow passages forced their fleet to funnel together, stripping away their advantage of mobility. Every wave carried them closer to a nightmare of the Roman army's making. From the cliffs, archers waited. Their arrows would rain down, striking ships and men alike. Hidden artillery, carefully positioned in secret outposts, could topple masts, break oars, and cripple entire vessels. The villages along the coast, outwardly silent, acted as the eyes and ears of the city, signaling every Vandal movement to the general orchestrating this shadow war. Every detail had been calculated with precision, every scenario anticipated. The Vandals, confident in their numbers and reputation, pressed forward. Their scouts had reported what they believed were empty shores and minimal resistance. They did not notice the false fires burning in the distance, the phantom movements of troops, or the subtle signals guiding them into the trap. Hubris blinded them. Suddenly, the first ships struck the hidden stakes. The hulls groaned and splintered. Chaos erupted, men shouted, weapons clashed, and the Vandals scrambled to regroup. But the channel allowed no maneuvering. Each attempt to turn or retreat only led to more destruction. The Roman archers and artillery struck with deadly accuracy, exploiting the panic that began to ripple through the fleet. From hidden vantage points, the Roman general watched as his plan unfolded. He knew the Vandals' discipline would falter first, and he was right. Confusion spread like wildfire. Ships collided, oars broke under the strain. Warriors fell into the cold water, struggling to survive as their comrades screamed in panic. The very confidence that had carried them across the Mediterranean now betrayed them. The battle was not fought with the glory of open-field clashes. There were no grand charges or heroic formations. This was a war of shadows, of deception and precision. The Vandals' strength, their mobility and numerical superiority, counted for nothing in the channel that the Romans had chosen. Every move was anticipated, every retreat countered, every strike met with resistance. Hours passed with relentless intensity. The Vandals attempted to regroup, to form lines, to salvage some semblance of order. Each attempt failed. The Romans had planned for every contingency. Signals guided reinforcements into positions that struck the enemy, from angles they could not anticipate. By mid-morning, the fleet was in shambles. The Vandals, who had once feared nothing, now feared their own miscalculations and the cunning of their hidden enemy. On shore, the city held its collective breath. Citizens watched from distant windows and rooftops as the first signs of battle became visible in the water below. The victory was not yet complete, but the tide had clearly turned. The Vandals were trapped in a web of Roman strategy, forced to confront their arrogance in the most literal sense. And then, as the sun climbed higher, Genseric realized the truth. This was no ordinary resistance. His fleet was being systematically destroyed, not by sheer force, but by tactics he had never anticipated. Rome's shadow army had turned his own strengths into weaknesses. Panic turned into retreat. Confusion became defeat. By midday, the Vandals began to withdraw, abandoning ships and supplies. The Channel, once a pathway for conquest, had become a tomb for their pride and arrogance. Rome had survived the impossible. Yet the victory came with a quiet tension. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The city was safe for now, but the empire remained fragile. Internal divisions still ran deep. The Vandals, humiliated but not broken, would return in the years ahead. And so the question lingered, echoing in the minds of those who witnessed the day. Had Rome truly triumphed, or had it merely delayed an inevitable collapse? The secret battle had ensured survival for now, but history would almost forget it. It was a victory hidden in shadows, a triumph erased from chronicles, remembered only by those who had orchestrated it. Rome had survived, but its future would continue to hang in delicate balance, where cunning, secrecy, and courage would be tested again and again. The sun had climbed high over Rome, casting light on a city that had survived the impossible. The Vandals' fleet had been forced to retreat, broken and humiliated. Their ships lay damaged, some sunk, others stranded along the coastline, a silent testament to the genius and audacity of Rome's hidden defenders. Yet the city's relief was tempered by an uneasy quiet. Victory had come, but it was a fragile one, almost invisible to the world beyond the city walls. The secret of the ambush was known only to a few. The emperor himself, wary of political rivals and concerned for his reputation, downplayed the events in official reports. Generals and soldiers who had fought in the shadows were sworn to secrecy. Chroniclers, writing decades later, overlooked the battle entirely, leaving only faint hints of what had occurred. History would remember the Vandals' advance, but the brilliant stratagem that saved Rome would remain buried, a paradox of survival in a time of decline. Yet the consequences of that day rippled quietly, shaping the empire in ways few could see. Rome had learned that even a weakened force, if guided by cunning and precision, could strike decisively against a stronger enemy. Military tactics evolved. Commanders began to recognize the value of intelligence, deception, and terrain over sheer numbers. Ambushes, night attacks, and psychological strategies became a new art, lessons drawn from a battle almost no one would ever read about in history books. For the citizens, the relief was tangible but fleeting. Markets reopened slowly, families cautiously ventured into streets, and soldiers patrolled the walls with renewed vigilance. Yet beneath this calm, fear lingered. The Vandals were still out there, and their desire for conquest had not diminished. The city had survived the first wave, but how long could it endure? Among the few who understood the battle's true significance, whispers spread. Soldiers who had fought in the Channel spoke of the panic they had witnessed in the enemy ranks, of ships disabled by hidden stakes, of arrows raining from unseen heights. These were stories of cunning triumph, yet they were stories that could not be openly told. To preserve the empire, the secret had to remain a secret. Victory had to appear natural, almost inevitable. The Vandals, humiliated but unbroken, would return in later years, their strategy altered by the lessons of that day. They approached future campaigns with caution, respect tinged with fear for an empire that could still surprise them despite its weakness. Rome's shadow army had not only preserved the city, it had sent a message that cunning, patience, and adaptability were weapons as potent as swords and spears. And yet, even as the city celebrated quietly, Rome's fragility remained. Political intrigue continued behind palace doors. Corruption still gnawed at the empire's foundations, and resources were stretched thin. The ambush had bought time, but time alone could not restore the empire to its former glory. Every citizen and soldier understood, even if unspoken, that this victory was a temporary reprieve, a moment of brilliance in a long decline. The young general, whose name would almost vanish from history, moved through the city unseen, watching the aftermath. His plans had worked flawlessly, yet he understood the irony. Rome had survived, but at the cost of remaining in perpetual tension. The empire's enemies had been checked, but not destroyed. The city could breathe for now, but only just. And in the quiet hours of the evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a haunting question hung in the air. Could Rome truly endure against the tides of history? Or had this hidden victory merely postponed the inevitable? The answer would come only with time, in battles that might never be chronicled, in victories and defeats as fleeting and shadowed as the one that had saved the eternal city that day. The secret battle had achieved something remarkable. It had preserved Rome when all seemed lost. It had taught lessons in strategy, patience, and courage. And yet, it had remained invisible to the world, a silent paradox, a triumph hidden in the shadows. Rome survived, but its story was far from over. The Vandals would return, other enemies would rise, and the fragile balance of power would continue to test the empire. The events of that day were a reminder. In history, triumph and decline often coexist, and the line between survival and destruction is thinner than any sword. Rome had survived. The Vandals had been repelled, their fleet broken, their arrogance shattered. The eternal city, battered and bruised, had endured when all the signs pointed to its destruction. And yet the victory was almost invisible in history. Few remembered the shadowy battle that had saved the city. Few understood the cunning and courage that had preserved Rome's heart, while the empire around it continued to crumble. It was a paradox. Rome was dying, weakened by corruption, political strife, and economic decay. Yet in a single, decisive moment, it had triumphed. Its survival did not stem from overwhelming force, nor from divine favor. It came from strategy, foresight, and the audacity of men willing to defy impossible odds. The city endured because a small, determined group of individuals chose to act when others had given up hope. The young general, whose name would fade from the annals of history, had orchestrated the impossible. He had understood the Vandals not as conquerors, but as predictable human beings, prone to arrogance and overconfidence. He had turned their strengths into weaknesses, their pride into vulnerability. And in doing so, he had secured a future for Rome, one battle at a time, in the shadows. Yet, even in victory, the empire remained fragile. Political intrigue continued, threats lingered, and the Vandals, though defeated, were not vanquished. Rome had survived the immediate danger, But the challenges that had haunted it for decades remained. The city's endurance was temporary, a fleeting triumph in a long, uncertain decline. This is the nature of history. Triumph and decline often coexist. A civilization can wobble on the brink of collapse and yet strike back with brilliance that leaves its enemies stunned. Rome had done exactly that, surviving the Vandals not because it was strong, but because it was clever. It had turned desperation into strategy, weakness into advantage, and secrecy into a weapon more powerful than any legion. The hidden battle left a mark on those who witnessed it, even if the world at large never knew. Soldiers told whispered tales of the ambush, of the Vandals trapped and disoriented, of arrows raining from unseen heights, and stakes hidden beneath the waves. These stories, passed quietly from one generation to the next, became the invisible threads that stitched the city back together in a moment of crisis. And yet, the paradox remained. Rome had survived a cataclysm, but it could not survive everything. The empire continued to weaken, other enemies loomed, and the fragile balance of power hung by a thread. The hidden victory was a bright spark in a gathering darkness, a reminder of what was possible, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. It is a story almost lost to time, a triumph hidden in the shadows, preserved only by the few who understood its significance. And it teaches a lesson that echoes through the centuries. Survival does not always belong to the strongest, nor does glory always follow the deserving. Sometimes it belongs to those who are willing to act with courage, wit, and relentless determination when the world expects them to fail. Rome survived the Vandals, yet it remained vulnerable. It endured, but only just. The paradox of that day, of the shadowy battle that no one remembers, is a reminder that history is rarely simple. It is a tapestry of triumphs and defeats, of brilliance and failure, of moments hidden from view, yet critical to the fate of civilizations. The eternal city, against all odds, lived to see another dawn. Its walls still stood, its people still breathed. And somewhere in the quiet, uncelebrated victories of the past, the lesson lingered. Even when everything seems lost, the outcome is never truly certain until the final move is made. Rome had survived the Vandals. The empire had survived the impossible. And yet, as the centuries would show, survival was never permanent. Only the memory of courage and cunning could endure, quietly shaping the course of history in ways that few would ever know.